Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to a time when going to sleep wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. Picture this with me for a moment. It's 20,000 years ago. You're somewhere in what will one day be called France, but right now it's just endless ice, wind, and darkness. The sun has disappeared behind distant glaciers. Temperature? Around minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. That's before we factor in the wind chill. And you're about to go to sleep. No heated blankets. No insulated sleeping bags. No cozy cabin with a thermostat you can adjust from your phone. Just you, your family group, some animal skins, and a small fire that keeps threatening to die. So how did they do it? How did our ancestors, people with the same biology as us, the same need for warmth, the same vulnerability to frostbite, manage to close their eyes and rest in conditions that would kill most of us within hours? Tonight, we're going to find out. We'll explore the ingenious, sometimes desperate, always fascinating strategies that kept early humans alive through the longest, coldest nights in human history. From the physics of body heat to the social bonds that literally saved lives, from cave architecture to emergency blizzard tactics. Some of these methods were brilliant. Some were eccentric. And some, well, you'll see. But here's what strikes me most about this story. Every single person alive today is descended from someone who figured this out. Someone who solved the puzzle of Ice Age sleep. Your great-great-great ancestors, going back hundreds of generations, all survived those frozen nights. Which means you carry their solutions in your DNA. Before we go further, I want to ask something. If you find these sleepy tales comforting, you can like and subscribe, but only if it feels right. No pressure. I make these videos for people who genuinely enjoy this slow, gentle approach to history. And I'm curious, where are you right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing that someone might be drifting off in Tokyo while another person's just waking up in Toronto. All of us connected by these stories of how humans used to sleep. Now, here's what we know for certain. The Ice Age wasn't one long freeze. It came in waves, periods called glacial maximums, when ice sheets covered vast portions of North America, Europe, and Asia. The last glacial maximum peaked around 20,000 years ago. During these periods, average temperatures in Europe dropped by 25 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit compared to today. But humans didn't just endure this. They thrived. They created art. They raised children. They told stories. They laughed probably around those small fires. And every single night, they had to solve the same problem: how to stay warm enough to wake up the next morning. The solutions they found weren't written down. Writing wouldn't be invented for another 15,000 years. Instead, we've pieced together their strategies from archaeological evidence. Sleeping sites, burned areas, animal bones, patterns in how shelters were constructed, and from modern survival experts who've tried to replicate Ice Age conditions. Most lasted about 3 hours before giving up. Our ancestors lasted generations. Tonight, we're going to walk through their world, step by step, strategy by strategy. We'll see how fire worked as the original central heating, how they turned caribou and mammoth into wearable blankets, why sleeping alone was basically a death sentence, and what they did when everything went wrong, when the fire died, when the storm came too fast, when shelter failed. We'll also encounter some debates. Historians still argue whether caves were the safe havens we imagine or dangerous traps filled with smoke and predators. We'll look at the evidence on both sides, and we'll meet the Neanderthals, our evolutionary cousins who might have actually been better at this than we were. But all of that comes later. For now, I just want you to sit with that image. 20,000 years ago, minus 20 degrees, darkness, wind, and somehow, some way, a family group settling down for the night, knowing they'd wake up to see another sunrise. It's humbling, isn't it? We complain when the AC goes out. They survived without it ever existing. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's discover how humans learned to sleep in the coldest bedroom our species has ever known. And maybe, just maybe, we'll sleep a little better ourselves knowing we carry that strength forward. Let's talk about fire. Not fire as you know it, A quick flick of a lighter, a turn of a gas knob, an electric switch that brings instant warmth. Ice Age fire was different. It was life itself. Imagine you're that person again, settling down for the night 20,000 years ago. The wind is howling outside your shelter. Temperatures dropping. And between you and freezing death is a small pile of burning wood that took hours to create. No matches, no lighters, no emergency backup heat source. Just friction, patience, and hope. Archaeological evidence from sites across Europe shows us that Ice Age humans were absolute masters of fire management. At the Dolny Vestanis site in what's now the Czech Republic, researchers found hearths that burned continuously for months, maybe years. These weren't campfires. They were lifelines. Here's what we know about how they worked. The ideal sleeping fire wasn't actually a roaring blaze that would consume too much fuel and create too much heat variation. Instead, they built what survival experts today call a long fire. Picture this: log arranged in parallel lines, burning slowly from one end to the other. The heat was steady, predictable, conservable, and absolutely critical. A well-maintained sleeping fire could keep a small cave or shelter at around 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit when it was minus 20 outside. That's not comfortable by modern standards, but combined with animal furs and body heat, it was survivable. But here's the thing that keeps me awake sometimes when I think about it. Fire dies. Without constant attention, even the best-laid fire will burn down to embers, then ash, then nothing. And in that nothing is death. So someone had to stay awake. We'll talk more about the fire tenders later, but for now, just sit with that reality. Every single night for thousands of years, someone in your family group had to fight their own exhaustion to keep feeding that fire. Your life depended on their wakefulness. Now here's one of those eccentric details I love. At some Ice Age sites, archaeologists have found what they call firestones, specific rocks that were heated in fires and then moved around shelters like primitive space heaters. Soapstone was particularly prized because it holds heat for hours. These people were essentially creating thermal batteries. Heat up a large soapstone rock in the main fire, then place it near sleeping areas. Wrap it in hides to prevent burns. Let it radiate warmth through the night. It's brilliant, right? But it required planning, knowledge, the ability to identify which stones held heat and which ones exploded when heated. Yes, that happened, and yes, it was probably terrifying. Historians still argue whether fire placement was more art or science. Some evidence suggests hearths were positioned precisely to maximize heat reflection off cave walls. Others argue that placement was more opportunistic, wherever smoke ventilation worked best. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Trial, error, and a lot of cold nights taught them what worked. But fire wasn't just about heat. It also provided light, crucial for psychological survival during winters when darkness lasted 16, 18, sometimes 20 hours a day. And it kept predators away. Cave bears, wolves, cave lions. All those nightmare creatures that share the Ice Age landscape with humans. A fire meant safety on multiple levels. So how do they keep fires going? First, they were obsessive about fuel collection. Deadwood gathering wasn't a casual afternoon activity. It was survival work. Groups would stockpile wood whenever possible, storing it in dry areas of caves and shelters. Animal fat played a role too. Rendered fat from seals, mammoths, or reindeer could be used to keep flames burning when wood was scarce. Some sites show evidence of bone burning. Yes, bones, which produce intense heat, though terrible smoke. You do what you must. Second, they mastered ember preservation. Before sleeping, they'd bank the fire, covering hot coals with ash to slow burning while maintaining heat. A properly banked fire could smolder for 12 to 18 hours. But that's where the midnight fire tender comes in. Because even banked fires need attention. And when the whole group is asleep, wrapped in furs, exhausted from the day's survival, someone has to stay awake enough to notice when the embers are fading. We found evidence of sleeping arrangements organized around fires in concentric circles. The most vulnerable, children, elderly, injured, slept closest to the warmth. The stronger adults slept in outer rings, both to conserve the best heat for those who needed it and to act as windbreaks. It's communal survival architecture. Every body placement had purpose. Here's something that surprised researchers. Fire management skills varied significantly between groups. Some Ice Age communities were clearly better at this than others. Sites in southern Europe show more sophisticated hearth construction than northern sites, possibly because southern groups have been dealing with fire longer. But northern groups had to learn fast. Failure meant extinction. And yet, despite all this mastery, fire remained dangerous. Carbon monoxide, poisoning in poorly ventilated caves, burns from sleeping too close, accidental fires consuming shelters. The thing that saved you could also kill you. There's something almost poetic about that, isn't there? The duality of fire, warmth and danger, life and death, all flickering together in that small orange glow. As you're lying there tonight, maybe glance at your thermostat, your electric heater, your central heating that you never think about. Somewhere in your ancestry, someone sat awake through a frozen night, feeding small sticks into dying embers, keeping that flame alive so their family could wake up. You're here because they didn't fall asleep. You're here because someone hundreds of generations ago understood that fire wasn't just helpful. It was everything. Now let's talk about what you're wearing to bed. Or rather, what you're wrapping yourself in. Because in the Ice Age, your blanket was also your coat, your insulation, and sometimes your emergency shelter. Everything was the skin of something that used to be alive. Modern sleeping bags are marvels of engineering. Synthetic fills, temperature ratings, moisture-wicking fabrics. But pound for pound, nothing we've invented matches the insulation value of properly prepared animal fur. And Ice Age humans knew this intimately. At sites across Europe and Asia, archaeologists have found scraping tools specialized for preparing hides. These weren't crude implements. They were precision instruments designed to remove every bit of fat and tissue from animal skins without damaging the fur. Because damaged fur meant reduced insulation. And reduced insulation meant death. The process was labor-intensive. After hunting a reindeer or mammoth, the skin had to be carefully removed, then scraped clean, then treated with animal brains. Yes, brains, which contain natural oils that keep leather supple and prevent it from becoming stiff and cracking. Historians still argue whether brain tanning was discovered independently by multiple groups or spread through cultural transmission. Either way, it was universal among Ice Age peoples. They all figured out that brains made better leather. Here's what a typical sleeping setup looked like. Bottom layer, thick hide, fur side down, creating a barrier between your body and the frozen ground. This is crucial. Ground cold kills faster than air cold. Middle layer, your body, ideally wearing a fur garment. Top layer, more hides, fur side in, trapping your body heat. It's the same principle as modern insulation. Create dead air spaces. Trap warmth. Prevent heat loss. Simple physics. Brilliant execution. But not all furs were equal. Reindeer hide was particularly prized because the individual hairs are hollow. They're basically tiny insulation tubes. A reindeer hide could keep you warm in conditions that would defeat bear fur. Mammoth fur was thick but heavy. Wolf pelts were warm but rare. Seal skins were waterproof, crucial for coastal groups. They knew the properties of each animal's covering the way we know thread counts. And they mixed and matched based on need. Children got the softest, warmest furs. Nursing mothers needed easy access, so their wrappings were designed differently. Hunters who might need to wake and move quickly used lighter configurations. Every person's sleeping setup was customized. Now here's one of those eccentric details that fascinates me. At several Ice Age sites, researchers have found evidence of feather use, specifically down from waterfowl, stuffed into hide pouches to create primitive pillows and additional insulation layers. These people invented down jackets 20,000 years before we thought we did. They'd hunt ducks and geese, carefully pluck the down, and store it in sealed leather pouches. When properly prepared, down maintains its loft and insulation properties almost indefinitely. Some of these pouches show signs of being repaired multiple times. They were treasured possessions, passed down through generations. Your great-great-grandmother's down pillow. Literally. But fur and feathers alone weren't always enough. On the coldest nights, when temperatures dropped to -30 or below, Ice Age humans had another trick. Rendered animal fat. Not for eating, though they did that too. For wearing. They'd heat animal fat until it liquefied, then apply it to exposed skin, faces, hands, anywhere that might be exposed to air. The fat created a protective barrier against wind and cold, similar to how modern petroleum jelly works. Some groups apparently mixed the fat with charcoal or ochre, creating a paste that was easier to apply and possibly provided additional protection. Imagine it. A family preparing for sleep, carefully applying fat to each other's faces, the same way you might apply moisturizer before bed. Except this moisturizer was bear grease. And it wasn't about beauty, it was about keeping your nose from freezing off. Here's something that surprised researchers. Analysis of sleeping areas shows that Ice Age humans use surprisingly thick layering, sometimes 6 or 7 hides stacked on top of each other. That's not just insulation, that's weight. And weight matters. Heavy blankets create a cocoon effect, reducing air circulation, maintaining warmth. They also provide psychological comfort, that feeling of being safely tucked and that humans seem to crave across all cultures and time periods. We still buy weighted blankets for the same reason. They knew this 20,000 years ago. But all this fur required maintenance. Hides needed to be dried after use. Moisture is the enemy of insulation. They needed to be beaten to keep them supple. Checked for parasites. Repaired when torn. It was a full-time job just maintaining your bedding. Some sites show evidence of communal hide working areas, where the whole group would gather to repair, treat, and maintain their sleeping materials. It was probably social time, a chance to talk and bond while doing necessary work. The ancient equivalent of folding laundry together. Except the laundry kept you alive. There's also evidence that different groups developed regional preferences. Northern groups used heavier, thicker configurations. Groups near the coast incorporated seal, fat more extensively. Mountain groups favored layering strategies that could be quickly adjusted as temperatures fluctuated. Innovation was constant. Survival demanded it. And here's what strikes me about all this. Every single technique, the layering, the fat application, the down collection, the hide preparation, required knowledge. Knowledge that had to be taught, demonstrated, practiced. A child growing up in the Ice Age didn't just learn to hunt or gather. They learned thermodynamics through lived experience. They learned material science by watching hides being prepared. They learned survival through apprenticeship in staying warm. Education was inseparable from survival. And all of it, every technique, every bit of knowledge was tested nightly. If you got it wrong, you didn't wake up. So tonight, as you pull your manufactured blanket up to your chin, made in some factory you'll never see, designed by engineers who calculated its R value, maybe think about that person 20,000 years ago, wrapping themselves in reindeer hide, applying bear fat to their cheeks, adjusting 7 layers of fur just right, knowing that their knowledge, their preparation, their attention to detail was the difference between morning and nothing. They were wearing their survival every single night. So let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the bear in the cave. When you think of Ice Age humans sleeping, you probably picture them in caves. Deep, protected, sheltered from the wind. Safe. But were they? This is one of the most fascinating debates in Ice Age archaeology, and it's still not settled. Were caves the safe havens we imagine, or are they dangerous compromises that came with serious risks? Let's look at both sides. First, the case for caves. The obvious advantage is shelter from wind. Wind chill can drop the effective temperature by 20 or 30 degrees. A cave entrance, even without any other modifications, blocks that wind. Instant warmth boost. Caves also provide what engineers call thermal mass. Rock holds heat. So a fire burning in a cave doesn't just warm the air, it warms the stone walls, which then radiate heat back for hours. It's passive heating. Free energy. Archaeological evidence shows that some caves were occupied repeatedly over thousands of years. The same sites, used generation after generation. That suggests they worked pretty well. At Lascaux in France, At Altamira in Spain, at countless other sites, we find evidence of long-term habitation. Sleeping areas, hearths, art on the walls. These weren't just emergency shelters. They were homes. But here's where it gets interesting. Not all caves were occupied. In fact, most weren't. Archaeological surveys show that Ice Age humans were surprisingly selective about which caves they used. Why? Because caves came with problems. Serious problems. Problem 1. Smoke. Fire produces smoke. Smoke needs to go somewhere. In open air, it disperses. In a cave, especially a deep cave, it accumulates. Carbon monoxide poisoning was a real risk. We found sleeping areas positioned very carefully in relation to hearths, suggesting they understood airflow patterns. Some caves have natural chimneys, cracks in the ceiling that vent smoke. These were heavily favored. Caves without good ventilation were often avoided entirely, no matter how otherwise ideal they seemed. Problem 2. Moisture. Caves are often damp. Water seeps through limestone, condenses on walls, creates puddles. And moisture is the enemy of warmth. Damp furs don't insulate. Damp air conducts heat away from bodies faster than dry air. Even worse, moisture can lead to hypothermia, even in temperatures above freezing. So the ideal cave wasn't just any cave. It needed to be dry, well-ventilated, positioned where water wouldn't pool. That's a pretty narrow set of requirements. Problem 3, and this is the big one. Other animals wanted caves too. Cave bears, cave lions, wolves, hyenas, all looking for the same thing humans were looking for: shelter from a cold. And many of them were there first. Here's something that still gives me chills. At some cave sites, we find human sleeping areas and bear dens in the same cave system, sometimes in the same chamber. Either they were using the space at different times, or they were coexisting in some kind of tense arrangement we can barely imagine. Historians still argue about this. Some believe humans and cave bears actively competed for cave space with violent confrontations. Others think they had some kind of seasonal time-sharing arrangement. The evidence is ambiguous. But one thing's clear. Sleeping in a cave meant sleeping with the knowledge that something large and hungry might also consider it home. Not exactly restful. So what about alternative shelters? Because Ice Age humans didn't just use caves. Archaeological evidence shows they built structures. At Mesorik in Ukraine, researchers found the remains of huts made from mammoth bones. Massive structures using skulls, tusks, and bones as a framework, covered with hides. These weren't temporary shelters. They were engineered buildings. The bone framework provided structural support. Hides stretched over the top created an enclosed space. Rocks held everything down against the wind. Inside, a hearth. Sleeping areas arranged around it. Everything humans needed. And no bears. At Dolny Vestinus, remember that site from earlier? They built semi-subterranean houses. Dug down into the earth, then built up walls using stone and bone, creating shelter that was partially underground. The earth itself provided insulation. These structures show sophisticated understanding of heat retention, airflow, and weather protection. They were custom designed for Ice Age conditions. So why use caves at all? Time and resources. Building a mammoth bone hut required killing multiple mammoths, processing bones, collecting hides, and investing hundreds of hours of labor. A cave was ready-made. Find a good one, move in, manage the fire carefully. It was the difference between building a house and renting an apartment. Both have advantages. Here's my favorite eccentric detail about this debate. At some sites, we find evidence of what archaeologists call cave enhancement. Humans modifying caves to make them work better. Stone walls built inside, cave entrances to create windbreaks. Channels dug to redirect water flow. Platforms built up from the floor to create dry sleeping areas. They were renovating. In the Ice Age, can you imagine? Someone 20,000 years ago thinking, this cave is almost perfect, but if we just build a small wall here. It's so human it hurts. The truth seems to be that Ice Age peoples used whatever worked. Caves when available and suitable. Constructed shelters when necessary. Rock overhangs as temporary solutions. Even temporary snow shelters in emergencies. They were pragmatists, survivors. The romantic image of cave people living exclusively in caves is probably wrong. They were more flexible, more innovative, more adaptive than that. But the cave debate persists because it matters. The type of shelter you choose affects everything else: fire management, sleeping arrangements, defense strategies. Your shelter determined your survival strategy. Choose wrong, and it didn't matter how good your furs were or how well you maintained your fire. So tonight, in your house or apartment with its walls and roof and doors that lock, maybe think about that decision. Cave or construction, bears or building, safety or smoke. Every night, they made that calculation. Every night, they had to get it right. And most nights, somehow they did. Let's talk about something we don't discuss much anymore: physical closeness. In our modern world, we prize personal space. We have our own beds, our own rooms. We sleep alone or with just one other person. But in the Ice Age, sleeping alone was essentially suicide. Huddling wasn't optional. It was physics. The human body produces heat, about 100 watts at rest, roughly equivalent to a standard light bulb. Alone, in minus 20-degree weather, that's not nearly enough. But 3 bodies together? 4? 5? Now you're generating 300, 400, 500 watts of heat in a concentrated space. That's survivable. Research done with modern survival experts shows that a group of 5 people sleeping in close contact can raise the temperature of their immediate sleeping area by 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit compared to the ambient temperature. That's the difference between hypothermia and survival. And Ice Age humans knew this instinctively. Archaeological evidence from sleeping sites shows distinctive patterns. Bodies arranged like spokes on a wheel, feet toward the fire, heads outward. Or in parallel rows, pressed close together. Or in tight circles, children in the middle. Every configuration designed to maximize shared warmth. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from earlier? Well, this is even more fundamental. This is humans using each other as heating elements. It's beautifully efficient and deeply intimate. Think about what this means. You're sleeping pressed against people, family, yes, but also other members of your band. Feeling their breathing, their warmth, their presence. Privacy didn't exist, not the way we understand it. Every night was communal by necessity. You fell asleep touching someone. You woke up touching someone. The boundary between your body and someone else's body was constantly negotiated. This probably shaped Ice Age society in ways we can barely imagine. Trust became paramount. You literally couldn't survive without it. If someone rolled away in their sleep, creating a gap that let cold air in, everyone suffered. Social bonds weren't just emotional. They were thermal. Here's something fascinating. At some sites, we find evidence of what archaeologists call sleeping assignments, consistent patterns suggesting that specific people slept in specific positions night after night. The strongest adults on the outside, acting as windbreaks. Children in the protected middle. Elderly close to the fire. Nursing mothers positioned for easy feeding. It was organized, thoughtful, tactical. Every person had a role in the collective thermal system. Historians still argue about whether these arrangements were consciously designed or evolved naturally through trial and error. Probably both. But the result was the same: a human sleeping configuration optimized for heat retention and survival. Now here's an eccentric detail that surprised researchers. At several sites, we found evidence of dogs, early domesticated wolves, sleeping with human groups. Not just near them, with them. In the huddle, dogs produce body heat too. And they have fur. They're basically ambulatory insulation. There's a theory that early dog domestication was partially driven by this thermal benefit. A dog wasn't just a hunting partner or a guard. It was a living heat source. The phrase three-dog night comes from this. Indigenous peoples in cold climates would judge temperature by how many dogs you needed in your sleeping arrangement. 1-dog night, chilly. 3-dog night, brutally cold. Ice Age humans figured this out 15,000 years ago. But huddling had drawbacks too. Disease spread faster in close contact. Parasites, lice, fleas moved easily between bodies. Conflicts couldn't be escaped. If you had a fight with someone during the day, you still had to sleep pressed against them that night. Because the alternative was freezing. Social cohesion wasn't just nice to have. It was mandatory. This might explain why Ice Age bands were relatively small, usually 20 to 30 people. Large enough for effective heat sharing, small enough to maintain social bonds. Too many people, and conflicts become unmanageable. Too few, and you don't generate enough collective warmth. There's an optimal band size for Ice Age survival, and every group that survived found it. Here's something that makes me think. Infants and small children generate less body heat than adults. They're also more vulnerable to cold. Higher surface area relative to body mass means they lose heat faster. So children were always positioned in the warmest spots, always protected by adult bodies on all sides, always given the best furs, not out of sentiment, though I'm sure that existed too, but out of survival necessity. Children who froze didn't grow up to have children of their own. The band's future died with them. So child protection was built into the sleeping arrangement at a fundamental level. Evolution and culture working together. There's also evidence of rotation systems. The people sleeping on the cold outside positions one night would rotate to warmer inside positions the next night. Fairness built into survival strategy. Everyone took turns suffering, so no one suffered too much. And here's the thing that strikes me most powerfully about all this. Huddling required trust. Complete, absolute trust. You had to trust that people wouldn't steal your furs while you slept, wouldn't take more than their share of warmth, wouldn't abandon the group if things got desperate. That trust had to be earned, maintained, reinforced every single day, because every single night you were literally putting your life in each other's hands. Modern humans talk about trust falls and team-building exercises. Ice Age humans lived it. Every night was a trust fall into the arms of your band. And if they didn't catch you, you died. So tonight, as you settle into your individual sleeping space, your private bed with its personal temperature control, maybe take a moment to think about that. About sleeping shoulder to shoulder with your entire family. About children tucked between adults. About dogs curled at your feet. About the rise and fall of breathing all around you. About sleeping in a pile of humans and animals, all generating heat, all dependent on each other. About the intimacy of survival. It's something we've lost, isn't it? That necessity of closeness. We gained privacy and space and individual comfort. But we lost something too. The deep knowledge that we need each other. Not just emotionally or socially, but physically, thermally, essentially. They knew they needed each other. Every night proved it. Now I need to talk about the loneliest job in the Ice Age. Fire tender. Picture it again. The whole band is sleeping, wrapped in furs, huddled together, breathing softly, bodies generating collective warmth. And you're awake. Not because you want to be, because you have to be, because if the fire dies, everyone dies. It's that simple, that brutal. Fire, as we discussed earlier, doesn't maintain itself. Even a well-built hearth, carefully banked with ash, will eventually burn down to nothing if left unattended. And nothing means death. So someone had to watch. All night. Every night. The archaeological evidence for this is indirect but compelling. At multiple Ice Age sites, we find hearths positioned specifically where a seated person could reach the fire while also having a view of the shelter entrance. Strategic positioning for someone staying awake. We also find personal items, tools, carved objects, near these positions, suggesting people kept their hands busy during the long watch hours. Because staying awake is hard, especially when everyone else is sleeping. When it's warm and dark and your body is screaming for rest. When you've spent the entire day hunting or gathering or processing hides and every muscle aches. But you can't sleep. Not yet. Not during your watch. Historians still argue about how watch rotations worked. Some believe it was simple. Adults took turns switching every few hours. Others think certain individuals became specialists, people who were naturally good at staying awake. The evidence supports both theories. At some sites, sleeping positions suggest regular rotation. Different people positioned near the hearth on different nights. At other sites, patterns suggest consistency. The same spot used by the same person repeatedly. Maybe different bands had different systems. Or Maybe individuals within bands had different roles. But one thing's certain, the fire tender's burden was real, and it was heavy. Here's what a typical watch might involve. First, monitoring the fire itself. Not just keeping it burning, but keeping it burning correctly. Too hot, and you waste fuel. Too cool, and the shelter doesn't stay warm enough. You're constantly adjusting, adding small pieces of wood, repositioning logs, banking coals when the fire's too strong, stirring them when it's weakening. It's an art form, a skill that takes years to master. Second, watching for problems. Sparks that might catch on furs or bedding. Smoke backing up if wind direction changed. Embers rolling out of the fire pit. Any of these could be catastrophic. Third, listening. For wind changes outside. For movement in the darkness beyond the shelter. For the breathing patterns of the sleeping group. Making sure everyone's okay. You're not just tending fire. You're tending people. Fourth, managing your own exhaustion. Staying alert when your body wants to shut down. Finding ways to keep yourself awake without disturbing sleepers. It's a psychological challenge as much as a physical one. Here's an eccentric detail that emerged from experimental archaeology. When researchers tried to replicate Ice Age sleeping conditions, they found that modern people struggled intensely with the fire-tending role. Not because of the physical work, that's relatively easy, but because of the isolation. Being awake while everyone else sleeps creates a profound sense of separation. You're there, but you're not part of the sleeping group. You're in between states. Awake, but wanting to sleep. Present, but alone. One researcher described it as the loneliest 3 hours of my life. And that was just 3 hours. Ice Age fire tenders might have 4, 5, 6-hour watches. Night after night. Month after month. Year after year. The psychological burden must have been immense. But maybe it wasn't always lonely. Maybe sometimes, watching over sleeping family members, hearing their breathing, seeing their peaceful faces in the firelight, was actually comforting. A different kind of connection. There's evidence suggesting fire tenders sometimes engaged in quiet activities. Tool-making that could be done silently. Carving. Maybe even creating some of the Ice Age art we've found. Those long, dark hours had to be filled somehow. And working with your hands helps fight drowsiness. Some researchers speculate that fire-tending time might have been used for thinking, planning, problem-solving. When else would you have uninterrupted time for contemplation? Maybe some of humanity's best ideas came from those midnight watches. But the burden was still there. Because the consequences of failure weren't abstract. If you fell asleep during your watch, people you loved would freeze. That's a weight most of us can't imagine carrying. And it wasn't just about staying awake. It was about staying awake enough, alert enough, capable enough. A fire tender fighting their own exhaustion might misjudge how much wood to add, or miss signs that the fire was dying, or fail to notice dangerous smoke accumulation. Mistakes happened. Of course they did. And when mistakes happen with fire in Ice Age conditions, people died. The survivors learned, adapted, developed better systems. But the learning curve was written in frozen bodies. Here's something that keeps occurring to me. Fire tending created a forced quiet time in Ice Age life. While everyone else slept, the tenders sat in silence, tending flames, alone with their thoughts. This might have been when people really processed their experiences, when they remembered, when they mourned losses or celebrated successes, when they existed outside the constant demands of survival just for a few hours. Maybe that solitude, as burdensome as it was, also provided something valuable. Space, stillness, silence, things we still crave today. But there was also the fear. Let's not romanticize this. Being awake in the dark in the Ice Age, with predators outside and death a constant possibility, that was terrifying. Every sound in the darkness beyond the fire, every shift of wind, every moment the fire guttered or sparked. Fear was your companion through those watches. And you couldn't show it. Couldn't wake others with your anxiety. Had to sit there, alone with your fear, keeping watch. That takes courage we rarely acknowledge. So tonight, when you turn off your bedroom light with a simple switch, when you set your thermostat to maintain steady temperature all night, when you go to sleep, knowing everything will be fine without your vigilance. Think about the fire tender. sitting in the dark, fighting exhaustion, feeding small sticks into flames, keeping watch over sleeping family, carrying the burden so others could rest. You're descended from people who did that, who stayed awake so others could sleep, who bore the loneliness so others could feel safe. Maybe whisper a thanks into the darkness. They'd probably appreciate that. Let's go underground for a moment, because not all Ice Age sleeping happened above ground. Some of the most ingenious solutions involve going down, not just finding cover, digging into the earth itself. At sites across Europe and Asia, archaeologists have found evidence of deliberately excavated sleeping pits, shallow depressions dug into cave floors or outdoor areas, specifically designed for sleeping. These weren't random holes. They were engineered solutions to a thermal problem. Here's the physics. The Earth, even in Ice Age conditions, maintains a relatively stable temperature a few feet below the surface. While the air temperature might swing wildly, -20 at night, 0 during the day, the ground stays more consistent, around 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit at shallow depths. That's still cold, but it's predictably cold, and predictable is manageable. So Ice Age humans dug sleeping pits about 1 to 2 feet deep, just enough to get below the wind and into that more stable thermal zone. Then they lined the pits with grass, moss, and dried plant material, then added furs on top of that. The result? A sleeping area that was insulated from below by earth, from the sides by pit walls that blocked wind, and from above by furs. It's a sleeping bag built into the ground. Archaeological evidence from sites like Mezhirek in Ukraine shows these pits arranged in organized patterns around central hearths. Each pit sized for 1 or 2 people, positioned to maximize heat from the fire while minimizing exposure to elements. Some pits show evidence of being used repeatedly over years. The compressed plant material at the bottom, gradually building up layers of organic matter that added additional insulation with each use. They were literally improving their beds by sleeping in them. Here's an eccentric detail that fascinates me. At some sites, researchers have found that the excavated dirt from sleeping pits was used to build raised berms around the pit edges. So not only did you dig down, but you built up walls around yourself, creating a sleeping nest that was protected from wind on all sides. It's brilliant environmental engineering with nothing but muscle and time. But digging sleeping pits required investment. You had to stay in one place long enough to make the labor worthwhile. This suggests some Ice Age groups were less nomadic than we often imagine, at least seasonally. During the worst winter months, when travel was nearly impossible anyway, they'd establish semi-permanent camps, dig sleeping pits, stockpile firewood, settle in for the long freeze. Historians still argue about how long these seasonal camps lasted. Some evidence suggests weeks, others months. It probably varied by location and conditions. But the existence of engineered sleeping pits shows planning, commitment, and sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics. Now let's talk about the plant material they used for lining these pits. This mattered enormously. Not all plants insulate equally. Dried grass, when properly arranged, creates countless tiny air pockets. Those air pockets trap heat. The same principle as modern insulation. Moss, particularly sphagnum moss, has exceptional insulating properties. It can hold up to 20 times its weight in water, which means when dried, it's incredibly light and puffy, perfect for creating that air pocket structure. At some sites, we've found evidence of feathers mixed into the plant material, creating a hybrid insulation system. They were basically making mattresses. Primitive, yes, but functional, and far more sophisticated than just sleeping on bare ground. Here's something that surprised researchers. The plant material in these pits needed to be changed regularly. Moisture from breathing, from bodies, from the ground itself would gradually compress and dampen the organic insulation. Damp plant material doesn't insulate. It conducts heat away. So there was a maintenance routine. Every few days or weeks, depending on conditions, the old plant material would be removed and replaced with fresh, dry material. This required constant gathering. Even in winter, even in harsh conditions, someone had to collect dried grasses and moss. It was never-ending work. But the alternative was sleeping on cold, damp, compressed plant matter that actively made you colder. So you did the work. Some sites show evidence of plant material storage, dried grasses and moss kept in protected areas, ready for pit refreshing. They were stockpiling, bedding the way we might buy extra sheets. Now here's where it gets interesting. Not all sleeping pits were created equal. Some were clearly better constructed, better positioned, better maintained than others. This suggests social hierarchy, even in Ice Age bands. The best pits, deepest, best positioned relative to fire, best lined, probably went to the most important or valuable band members. Leaders, skilled hunters, mothers with young children. Others got secondary positions. Survival was communal, but it wasn't perfectly egalitarian. Resources, including sleeping comfort, were allocated based on value to the group. That's a hard truth about Ice Age life. Not everyone got the warmest spot. But here's the thing that makes me think. Even the worst sleeping pit was better than no sleeping pit. Even the least comfortable position was still part of the protective system. Everyone had a place. Everyone was included, just not equally. Archaeological evidence also shows that some groups dug communal sleeping pits, larger depressions that could accommodate multiple people sleeping together. This combined the benefits of underground insulation with the thermal advantages of huddling. Physics layered on physics. These communal pits show the same careful lining and maintenance as individual pits. Sometimes more, because accommodating multiple bodies meant managing more moisture and compression. But the thermal benefits were substantial. A communal pit with 5 or 6 people could maintain internal temperatures 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the outside air. That's the difference between survival and comfort. Well, Ice Age comfort anyway. Here's an eccentric detail from experimental archaeology. When modern researchers tried sleeping in reconstructed Ice Age pits, they reported feeling incredibly secure. The pit walls created a psychological sense of protection beyond just the thermal benefits. Being in a depression, surrounded by earth walls covered by firs, it felt safe, like being held by the ground itself. Maybe Ice Age humans felt that too. Maybe the psychological comfort was as important as the thermal benefits. Both worked together to make sleep possible. But pits had drawbacks. Water could pool in them if drainage wasn't managed. They could collapse if dug in unstable soil. And getting in and out quickly, if danger threatened, was harder than sleeping on flat ground. So pit sleeping required trade-offs. Safety and warmth versus mobility and drainage. Different groups made different choices based on their specific conditions. There's also evidence of hybrid approaches. Shallow pits inside caves, combining the benefits of both strategies. Or pits with carefully engineered drainage channels to handle moisture. Innovation was constant. Every generation refined the techniques. And here's what strikes me most about all this. These sleeping pits required labor, yes, but they also required knowledge. Knowledge of earth temperatures, of plant properties, of moisture management, of wind patterns. Knowledge that was tested every single night. If you got it wrong, if you dug your pit in a spot where water pooled, or used the wrong plant material, or didn't maintain it properly, you suffered. Cold, damp, miserable sleep at best. Hypothermia at worst. So the knowledge mattered. It was passed down, refined, adapted to local conditions. Your grandparents taught your parents how to dig sleeping pits properly. Your parents taught you. You teach your children. Knowledge as survival currency. Tonight, as you climb into your elevated bed with its spring support and manufactured mattress, maybe think about those sleeping pits. About people digging into frozen earth, gathering dried moss, lining their sleeping depressions, building up protective berms, creating comfort and safety with nothing but knowledge, labor, and earth. They turned the ground itself into shelter. That's something worth remembering. Now let's talk about the nights when everything went wrong. Because it did. Often. The perfect shelter, the maintained fire, the carefully lined sleeping pit, the organized band huddling together. All of that assumed you made it to shelter before conditions turned deadly. But what happened when you didn't? What happened when the blizzard came faster than expected? When the hunting party got separated? When the shelter collapsed? when you were simply caught out in the open with darkness falling and temperature dropping. Emergency survival. The desperate measures. This is where we see the full extent of Ice Age human ingenuity under pressure. Archaeological evidence for emergency strategies is harder to find. By definition, these were temporary, desperate solutions that left minimal traces. But we do have some evidence, and it's fascinating. First, snow caves. In heavy snow conditions, Ice Age humans knew they could dig into snowdrifts to create emergency shelter. Snow, counterintuitively, is an excellent insulator. The air trapped between ice crystals creates thermal barriers. A properly constructed snow cave can maintain internal temperatures around 32 degrees Fahrenheit, even when it's minus 20 outside. That's a 52-degree difference, just from snow. But snow cave construction requires specific knowledge. You need consolidated snow, not powder. You need to dig upward from the entrance to create a cold sink. You need ventilation holes to prevent carbon dioxide buildup. Get any of this wrong, and you either freeze or suffocate. Ice Age humans figured it out through trial and error. Deadly error, probably at first, but eventually the knowledge spread. Survive a blizzard in a snow cave once, and you teach everyone you know how to do it. Here's an eccentric detail from modern survival testing. People who've tried emergency snow cave sleeping report that the psychological challenge exceeds the physical one. Being entombed in snow, even knowing it's protecting you, triggers primal fear. You're surrounded by the thing that's trying to kill you. But Ice Age humans did it anyway, because the alternative was certain death. Second, animal carcasses. Yes, you read that correctly. When caught in extreme conditions after a kill, Ice Age hunters sometimes sheltered inside the animals they just killed. Large animals, mammoths, woolly rhinos, giant elk, provided substantial thermal mass. The body cavity, while gruesome, offered protection from wind, and some retained warmth from the recently living animal. This sounds like something from a survival movie, but we have actual evidence. Tool marks on mammoth ribs, suggesting the ribcage was opened specifically for shelter. Remains positioned in ways that suggest human presence inside the carcass during processing. Historians still argue about how common this practice was. Some believe it was rare, used only in true emergencies. Others think it was more routine, practical use of every resource the animal provided. Either way, it happened, and it worked. Imagine being that person, exhausted from the hunt, temperature dropping, storm coming, and your only shelter is literally inside the thing you just killed. You climb in, pull the hide partially over yourself, wait out the storm. It's nightmare fuel and survival genius simultaneously. Third, group body heat maximization. In true emergency conditions, huddling techniques became extreme. Archaeological evidence and modern experimental survival suggest Ice Age humans understood that in desperate conditions, every gap between bodies was potentially lethal. So they'd arrange themselves in tightly packed configurations we'd find almost unbearably intimate. Bodies pressed together so closely that individual boundaries disappeared. The goal wasn't comfort. It was creating a single thermal mass. In the absolute worst conditions, this might mean adults surrounding children completely, forming a human shell of protected bodies. The adult on the outside would suffer more. Some might not survive, but the core, the children, the future, would live. That's a calculation we don't like to think about, but survival sometimes required it. Fourth, emergency fire starting without tools. If you were caught without your fire starting kit, and this could happen, Ice Age humans had backup methods. Friction fire with just sticks required enormous skill and time. In an emergency, with frozen hands and fading light, it might be impossible. But we have evidence they also used fire-carrying techniques. Smoldering punk wood or fungus kept in protective containers, maintained as emergency fire sources. If you had a smoldering ember, you could create fire even in difficult conditions. This required constant attention, though. Someone had to maintain that ember during all travels. It was insurance. Expensive insurance, but worth it. Here's something that surprised researchers. Analysis of Ice Age remains shows injuries consistent with extreme cold exposure, frostbite damage, particularly to extremities. These weren't random. The pattern suggests controlled sacrifice. In emergency conditions, people apparently protected core body temperature by allowing extremities to freeze. Better to lose fingers or toes than die. It's brutal pragmatism, but it worked. Survivors with frostbite damage lived to pass on their genes and knowledge. Those who didn't make such sacrifices didn't survive to be found. Fifth, emergency windbreaks from whatever materials were available. Piled rocks, stacked deadfall, even bodies of dead animals positioned to block wind. We found archaeological sites with stone arrangements that served no obvious purpose except wind protection, too temporary to be permanent structures, positioned in locations suggesting emergency use. They were building walls. Quick, crude, desperate walls. Anything to reduce wind chill while waiting out conditions or gathering strength to reach proper shelter. Now here's where it gets psychologically interesting. Modern survival psychology emphasizes the importance of will to survive. Technical skills matter, but mental state matters more. Ice Age humans must have understood this instinctively. In emergency conditions, keeping the group's morale up, maintaining hope, preventing panic, was as crucial as any physical strategy. We can't excavate morale, but we can infer it. The fact that Ice Age humans survive conditions that kill modern survival experts suggests they had something we lack. Not just physical toughness, though they had that, but psychological resilience. An absolute refusal to give up. Here's my favorite example of Ice Age emergency ingenuity. At several sites, we find evidence of what archaeologists call cold refuges, spots in a landscape that ancient peoples knew about and marked somehow. Natural features that provided slight advantages. Rock overhangs, dense evergreen groves, south-facing slopes. These weren't adequate for long-term survival. But in an emergency, knowing where these refuges were could mean reaching something rather than nothing. They memorized the landscape. Every potential advantage. Your life might depend on remembering that small overhang 3 valleys over. So you remembered. Historians still argue about how emergency survival knowledge was transmitted. Was it taught formally? Learned through stories? Acquired through personal experience? Probably all 3. But one thing's certain, the knowledge existed. It was shared. It was remembered. Because the groups that didn't have this knowledge didn't survive the first emergency. And here's what haunts me about all this. For every emergency strategy we've found evidence of, there were probably others we'll never know about. Techniques that worked but left no traces. Knowledge that died with the last person who used it. And then there are the emergencies where nothing worked. The times when the blizzard was too severe. The cold too extreme. The luck too bad. Those people didn't survive to teach their children what not to do. They just disappeared into the ice. So tonight, in your climate-controlled environment with emergency services just a phone call away, maybe think about those desperate nights. About people digging into snow with frozen hands. Sheltering in animal carcasses. Huddling so tightly they breathed as one organism. About the times when all the planning, all the preparation, all the knowledge wasn't enough. And you had to improvise. Desperately. Knowing death was right there. Your ancestors did that. They improvised their way through impossibility. And sometimes just barely they survived. Let's talk about our cousins. The ones who didn't make it. Neanderthals. Homo neanderthalensis. A separate species that lived alongside Homo sapiens for thousands of years before going extinct around 40,000 years ago. And here's the fascinating thing. They might have actually been better adapted to Ice Age sleeping than we were. Let that sink in for a moment. The species that went extinct might have had advantages over us in the one area we've been discussing all night, surviving the cold. So what happened? Why did they disappear while we survived? That's complicated. But let's focus on what we know about Neanderthal sleep strategies and cold adaptation. First, body structure. Neanderthals were built differently than Homo sapiens. Shorter, stockier, more robust skeletal structure, larger muscle mass relative to body size. This wasn't just aesthetic. It was thermal engineering. A compact body has less surface area relative to volume. Less surface area means less heat loss. It's the same reason Arctic animals tend to be rounder and stockier than their tropical relatives. Neanderthals followed this principle naturally. Their bodies were optimized for heat retention in a way modern human bodies simply aren't. Research suggests that a Neanderthal of the same weight as a Homo sapiens would lose heat about 10 to 15% slower due purely to body shape differences. That's significant. Over a cold night, that difference could mean survival versus hypothermia. Second, metabolic differences. Analysis of Neanderthal remains suggests they had higher basal metabolic rates than Homo sapiens. What does that mean? They burned more energy at rest. They produced more internal heat just existing. That's expensive in terms of caloric requirements. Neanderthals needed more food. But in Ice Age conditions, where cold was the primary threat, having a higher output internal furnace was worth the fuel cost. They were built to burn hot. Third, nasal structure. Neanderthals had distinctively large noses. For years, researchers debated why. Recent evidence suggests those large nasal passages helped warm and humidify cold air before it reached the lungs. This reduced respiratory heat loss and prevented lung damage from breathing extremely cold air. In -30-degree conditions, breathing itself can be dangerous. Cold air damages lung tissue, creates respiratory distress. Neanderthals' noses mitigated this risk. It's not a sleep-specific adaptation, but it mattered for nighttime survival. Breathing comfortably through cold nights without respiratory distress meant better sleep quality and better overall health. Here's an eccentric detail that fascinates me. Analysis of Neanderthal sleeping sites shows different patterns than Homo sapien sites. Neanderthal hearths tend to be smaller. Their sleeping areas less elaborately constructed. Why? Possibly because they needed less artificial heating. Their bodies did more of the work naturally. This isn't certain. Historians still argue about Neanderthal fire use sophistication. But the pattern exists. Less engineering, more biology. Fourth, genetic evidence. We now know that modern humans interbred with Neanderthals. Many of us carry Neanderthal DNA, typically 1 to 4% of our genome. Interestingly, some of these Neanderthal gene variants affect cold adaptation. Genes involved in fat metabolism, skin thickness, hair growth patterns. The Neanderthal genes that survived in modern humans tend to be ones that helped with cold survival. We literally absorbed their cold weather advantages through interbreeding. So here's the question that keeps researchers up at night. If Neanderthals were better adapted to Ice Age conditions, why did they go extinct while we survived? The answer seems to be that cold adaptation wasn't enough. Homo sapiens had other advantages, more sophisticated social structures, better long-distance communication, more innovative technology, greater cognitive flexibility. In a purely thermal competition, Neanderthals might have won. But survival is never purely about one thing. Here's something that strikes me. Imagine being a Neanderthal sleeping near a group of Homo sapiens. You're warmer naturally. You need less elaborate shelter. Your body is a more efficient heat generator, but they have better furs, more sophisticated fire management, larger social networks to pool knowledge. It's biology versus culture, hardware versus software. And in that competition, over tens of thousands of years, culture won. But there's something poignant about this. The species better adapted to the cold went extinct. The species that had to engineer its survival through intelligence and cooperation survived. Maybe that tells us something about being human. We're not the strongest. We're not the most naturally adapted. But we're the most innovative, the most social, the most stubbornly determined to survive through cleverness. Now let's talk about what happened when Neanderthals and Homo sapiens lived near each other. Because they did for thousands of years. Did they share sleeping strategies? Learn from each other? The evidence suggests yes. At some mixed sites, we find sleeping arrangements that combine Neanderthal and Homo sapiens characteristics. Smaller hearths like Neanderthals used, but with Homo sapiens-style sleeping pit construction. They were learning from each other, sharing survival knowledge. And through interbreeding, They were literally sharing genetics. Your potential Neanderthal DNA might include genes that help you sleep more comfortably in cold conditions, genes that regulate body temperature more effectively, genes that were honed by hundreds of thousands of years of Neanderthal evolution in Ice Age Europe. That's a legacy, a cold weather legacy. Here's an eccentric detail from recent research. Some scientists argue that Neanderthals might have had different sleep cycles than modern humans. Their eyes were slightly larger, possibly adapted for the long, dark winters of Ice Age Europe. This might have affected their circadian rhythms. Maybe they slept differently. Longer winter sleeps, shorter summer sleeps, more flexible daily rhythms. We don't know for certain, but it's fascinating to think about. Different species, different sleep patterns, sharing the same cold night. Historians still argue about why Neanderthals went extinct. Climate change, competition with Homo sapiens, disease, interbreeding leading to genetic absorption rather than extinction. Probably all of these factors played roles. But here's what we know. For tens of thousands of years, they survived Ice Age conditions that we would find nearly impossible without significant technological support. They slept through winters that would kill us. They raised children in conditions we can barely imagine. They endured, and then they disappeared. But not completely, because if you're of European or Asian descent, you probably carry pieces of them in your genome. Those pieces helped your ancestors survive cold nights. They still help you now, in subtle ways you'd never notice. When your body regulates temperature slightly more efficiently than expected. When you adapt to cold just a bit faster. When some ancestral gene kicks in during winter nights. That might be Neanderthal DNA doing its job. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, maybe acknowledge the possibility that somewhere in your genetic code, there's a whisper of a different human species. One that was built for the cold. One that survived through different strategies. One that taught us something about endurance, about adaptation, about finding different paths to the same goal. They're gone now. Their last pure-blooded member died 40,000 years ago. But their cold weather wisdom lives on. In genes, in archaeological evidence, in the strategies they pioneered that we still use. The cousins who didn't make it, but who left us gifts anyway, including, perhaps, the ability to sleep a little warmer on cold nights. That's worth remembering. And so we come to the end, not just of our story tonight, but of the Ice Age itself. Around 11,700 years ago, the glaciers began their retreat. Slowly at first, then faster. The long freeze that had gripped the planet for over 100,000 years started to loosen its hold. Temperatures rose. Ice sheets melted. Sea levels climbed. The world transformed. And those sleeping strategies we've been discussing all night, they started to change too. Not disappearing. Evolving. Because here's the thing about survival knowledge. Once learned, it doesn't just vanish when conditions improve. It gets carried forward. Adapted. Refined. The people who survived those frozen nights didn't forget how they did it. They remembered. Let's think about what happened as the ice retreated. Gradually, the desperate urgency of winter survival decreased. You could sleep with fewer furs, use less firewood, build less elaborate shelters. But you didn't abandon the knowledge. You still knew how to dig sleeping pits, how to manage fire through the night, how to prepare hides for maximum insulation, how to huddle effectively when needed. That wisdom became part of human culture, passed down generation after generation. Even when it wasn't always necessary, it was still taught, because you never knew when you might need it again. Archaeological evidence shows fascinating patterns as the Ice Age ended. Sleeping sites become less elaborate in some ways. Hearths get smaller. Shelters become more varied. But the core principles remain. Fire management, insulation, community sleeping arrangements. The tactics evolved. The strategy persisted. And here's something beautiful to consider. Every cold weather survival technique we use today traces back, in some way, to those Ice Age innovations. Insulated clothing? That's engineered fur layers. Sleeping bags? That's hide wrapping with modern materials. Central heating? That's fire management perfected over millennia. Emergency survival training? That snow cave knowledge, passed down through 20,000 years. We're still using their playbook. We've just upgraded the materials. But the fundamental understanding, how human bodies lose heat, how to prevent that loss, how to survive together when individually we'd fail, all of that comes from those desperate frozen nights. Your ancestors figured it out, and they made sure you'd know it too. Even if you've never dug a sleeping pit or tended a midnight fire, the knowledge exists in human culture because they preserved it. Think about indigenous peoples in cold climates. The Inuit, the Sami, the peoples of the Siberian North. Their sleeping strategies aren't random inventions. They're refinements of Ice Age techniques, improved over thousands of years, adapted to specific environments, but rooted in the same core wisdom. How to sleep when the world is trying to freeze you. And they still work? Arctic explorers today, when their technology fails, fall back on these ancient methods. Because they're not obsolete. They're fundamental. Here's something that moves me deeply. As the Ice Age ended and life got easier, humans didn't just survive, they flourished. Agriculture developed. Permanent settlements emerged. Civilization as we know it began. And none of that would have been possible if Ice Age humans hadn't first solved the problem of surviving the night. You can't farm if you can't survive winter. You can't build cities if you freeze every night. You can't develop art and philosophy and science if all your energy goes to not dying. The Ice Age sleeping strategies weren't just survival techniques. They were the foundation of everything that came after. Every warm bed in human history started with a cold night and desperate ingenuity. So what do we learn tonight? What can we take from this journey through frozen darkness? First, that humans are extraordinarily adaptable. We didn't have the right biology for Ice Age conditions. We weren't built for it, but we survived anyway. Through intelligence, through cooperation, through stubborn refusal to give up. Second, that survival is communal. Almost every strategy we discuss tonight involved multiple people working together. The fire tender staying awake for the group, the huddling arrangements, the shared knowledge. Nobody survived alone. Nobody. Third, that knowledge is survival currency. The groups that preserved and transmitted sleeping strategies survived. Those that didn't. Teaching was survival. Learning was survival. Remembering was survival. And fourth, that we're stronger than we think. Your ancestors endured conditions that would kill most modern humans within hours. That strength is in you. Genetically, culturally, historically, you come from survivors. From people who refused to let impossible conditions stop them. On the hardest nights, maybe remember that. Now, as we drift towards sleep tonight, comfortable, warm, safe, let's take a moment to honor those who came before. The fire tenders who stayed awake through exhaustion. The parents who gave children the warmest spots. The innovators who figured out sleeping pits and hide preparation and emergency snow caves. The ones who didn't make it, but whose sacrifice taught others what not to do. The Neanderthals who contributed their cold weather genetics to our survival. Every single person who closed their eyes in frozen darkness and somehow woke to see another dawn. You exist because they existed, because they survived, because they refused to give up, night after frozen night for thousands of years. That's your heritage, your lineage, your legacy. And maybe, in some small way, honoring that legacy means appreciating what we have now. The warm beds, the reliable heat, the safety we take for granted, but also carrying forward that same determination, that same innovation, that same commitment to helping each other survive whatever challenges we face. Because the ice may have retreated, the desperate cold may have ended, but the human spirit that survived those impossible nights, that endures. In you, in all of us, in every person who refuses to give up when conditions seem impossible. So let yourself drift now. Let the warmth surround you. Let your body relax in a comfort your ancestors could barely imagine. But carry their strength with you into sleep, their determination, their wisdom. You're warm tonight because they learned to survive the cold. And that's a gift worth honoring. As your breathing slows and deepens, as your muscles release their tension, as sleep begins to pull you gently down into darkness. Not the frozen darkness of Ice Age nights, but the safe, warm darkness of modern rest. Remember them. The ones who figured it out. The ones who survived. The ones who made sure you would too. Sleep well tonight. Sleep warm. Sleep safe. You've earned it. Through 20,000 years of ancestry, through countless frozen nights, through impossible survival, you've earned this peace. And somewhere in the vast expanse of human history, maybe those ancient fire tenders are finally resting too. Their watch is over. Their duty fulfilled. You're here. Warm. Safe. Alive. Mission accomplished. Sweet dreams.